Blair was the single most important partner in the invasion. And this is the story, the untold story of what happened. It was this back relationship. In any case, in 2008, when Iraq's oil ministry began handing out no-bid development contracts to a select group, one of the lucky parties was BP, a company that had as much influence in the Blair government as American oil companies had in the Bush-Cheney White House. Blair surrounded himself with at least a dozen executives from BP. And by the way, this has not been, as far as I know, in any article anywhere. In 1997, for example, he appointed BP chair David Simon to a newly created position, Minister of Trade and Competitiveness in Europe. The Prime Minister maintained such a close relationship with BP's CEO, Lord Brown, that newspapers dubbed the giant oil company, quote, Blair Petroleum. Although some wondered if it wouldn't be more fitting to call the British government the British Petroleum Government. Another of Blair's closest confidants and aides, an old friend from Edinburgh, left her job at 10 Downing Street to become Director of Communications at BP. This is in November 2001. It's an important year, 2001. A lot of things going on. Blair said he was, quote, sad over losing such a close confidant after 13 years, but Hunter's timing was fortuitous, as discussions were already underway about invading Iraq. According to The Observer, Bush raised the issue of removing Saddam with British support over dinner with Blair just 9 days after September 11. And by the way, I don't know if you've heard about that Cheney's Energy Committee, and they had those maps where they had the flags already in them of the various companies who wanted whatever they wanted. And this is all the way back in the early days of the Bush administration, long before the supposed decision to invade Iraq, long before 9/11, in fact. Now, one of the things in Family of Secrets is I interviewed a guy named Mickey Herskowitz. Mickey Herskowitz was a Texas journalist. He was actually a friend of the Bush family. And in 1999, he had approached George W. Bush and said, why don't we do a book together? You're running for president. Typically, candidates, you know, Obama did it too. You have a book out. McCain had a book. Let's do a book. So George W. Bush's response was, well, what do I make on this? How much do I earn on it? So anyway, he said, well, you'll get half and I'll do all the work. And Bush said, that sounds good to me. And so they began working on the book, or I should say Mickey began working on the book, and he had a number of meetings and phone conversations with Bush. And he told him, okay, now we have to talk about what you're going to do in office. That's going to make up a lot of the book. And Bush said, I'm sorry, first he said to him, let's talk about your life and what you've done in your life. And Bush said, forget it. Mickey told this to me back in 2004. This was a story I could not get published in the media. Bush said to him, he said, I don't want to talk about my life. He said, I really haven't done anything. Keep in mind, this is the year, he's already practically anointed President of the United States, and he's admitting to this guy there's really nothing. He's embarrassed to talk about his past. So Mickey is ready to practically throw up his hands. He says, well, Bush says, well, what else can we talk about? He says, well, you know, we can talk about what you're going to do in office. And Bush says, great, talk to Carl. Talk to Karl Rove. Karl Rove, this political campaign guy, is going to decide what they're going to do with America and the world. So he says, you know, I really have to get some material from you. Otherwise the book isn't going to feel authentic. So they do start talking about things. And Bush can't really seem to think of anything that he'd like to do as president. But suddenly he just perks right up and he says, well, you know, there is something that I'm going to do. And he says, what's that? And he says, well, you know, I think my dad made a real big mistake with Iraq. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, you know, he went in there and he stopped. He said, that's the difference between my dad and me. He said, when I go into Iraq, I'm going in all the way, and I'm going to take that dude out. Now, keep in mind, here's an admission by George W. Bush that the real reason he invaded Iraq. Now, this should be an earth-shattering headline, right? Could not get this story published because people told me, this was in 2004, we're afraid of what happened to Dan Rather. Remember Dan Rather with those memos and it destroyed his career? They said, it's too hot in the kitchen, we just can't afford to do any of these kind of stories. So we couldn't get this published, but he said to Bush, why do you want to invade Iraq? And he said, you know something, he said, you know, I've been an advisor to my father for years, and a lot of his key people have really convinced us that if you want to be president and you want to have a successful presidency, you have to have a war. You have to have a war, because that's the only way to get the American people behind you. They love a good war. They get excited. People are afraid of seeming unpatriotic. Remember this after 9/11? We were all quiet for a while, most of us anyway. He said, you know, that's what you have to do. And Maggie Thatcher did that, and I don't know if you know the details of that, but she was tremendously unpopular in England, and then they had the Falklands Islands, this little tiny place with more sheep than people, and boy, all the Brits from left to right were just out there waving the Union Jack. They were so excited because it's this rush that we all feel. It's like watching sporting competitions. You just get excited for the home team. Anyway, I'm going to go for maybe another 10 or 15. How are we doing on time? Does anybody know what time it is? 7:30. Okay, I'll go for another maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll save all the rest of the time for questions. One of the most interesting things that I discovered in the course of researching Family of Secrets was the secret life of Poppy Bush. And once I realized that he'd been in Intel, not just in 1976 when George Bush appointed him to run the CIA, but he'd been in Intel in the 1960s. And he'd been in Intel in the 1950s, and he'd been in Intel in the 1940s. He actually was in intelligence when he was a pilot in World War II. He was doing aerial reconnaissance, which was top secret work, with an intelligence unit controlled by General MacArthur. And then I discovered that General MacArthur was connected in with the Harriman family that were business partners with the Bushes. I even found a letter where General MacArthur's mother asked the Harrimans, Prescott Bush's business partners, would they give her son a job. And then years later, you see the widow, Mrs. MacArthur, living literally next door to Poppy Bush when he's UN ambassador. So I guess what I'm talking about here is this is a lot of detail, but to really understand how the world works, you need to study detail. If you write a book about the Bushes and you only have the Bushes in there and only a few names like Condi and this and that, these are not even the key figures. The key figures are these people like the Gamels and all these other people you never hear about because they're not really looking for publicity. In this country and in every country, there are very, very wealthy people who pass their money on to their children through tolerant inheritance laws, and they like to run the show. And this is not conspiracy theory. This is just the way that things work. I think that if you really look at almost any country, I was just at a conference of investigative reporters, and I was talking to someone from Sweden. He said, hey, that's the way it is even in Sweden, that there are these families that quietly try to shape things. And Sweden is the one we think of as so democratic and egalitarian. So everywhere there are elites. If you work in a company, there are elites in your company, and there's always a lot of back channel stuff going on and people trying to position themselves and maybe oust the person running Hewlett-Packard, Carly somebody or other, you know. So whatever it is, you always have these situations. In any case, with H.W. Bush, what I found was that because I knew he was in intelligence work all these years, I became very, very interested in particular traumatic episodes in American history. One of those was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, I didn't know much about that. I did know that there were an awful lot of books on the subject, and everybody either has an opinion or is wary of anyone who has an opinion on the subject. I didn't know what to make of it. I was perfectly okay with the Oswald theory, whatever. I just, you know, most journalists make a decision not to get into that stuff because it's just quicksand. You know, you got other things to cover and you're never going to come out of it. So I really wasn't inclined to look at it, but I did notice that Poppy Bush in an interview